Welcome to episode 2 of Stabbed in the Back podcast. I'm your host, Andy. I'm a physical therapist specializing in back pain. I'm joined today by my co host, Andrew, who is an exercise physiologist out of Sydney, who is also very passionate about treating chronic back pain and other chronic pain. Stabbed in the Back podcast is where you share your back pain stories. It's my goal to share stories from people who have conquered and overcome their back pain so that you too can have hope for what's possible. As you know, back pain is complex, many times requiring a very individual approach. And what can be most frustrating is that, let's say, a family member tells you chiropractic worked for them, but it hasn't worked for you. Maybe PT has worked for one person and not the next, and highlighting that every individual will respond a little bit differently to varying intervention and treatments. On top of that, your back pain's terrifying. You wonder if it'll last forever. You're fearful of movement. You don't want to make things worse. And the medical system oftentimes unintentionally leaves you feeling lost without answers, confused, and many times hopeless. Our guest joining us today is Kenza. She's sharing her story on how she was able to overcome her back pain after reading Alan Gordon's book, The Way Out. And if you're somebody that has tried everything to treat your back pain and nothing has worked, you'll find that if you've had persistent pain, maybe lasting longer than 3 or 6 months, you'll want to listen up to this whole episode because it's very interesting. But I'm asking you to have an open mind throughout. So thank you again for listening. And if you find these stories helpful, please don't hesitate to subscribe, give us our 5-star review, and share with somebody you know that has persistent back pain. Okay, let's dive in. Kenza, if you just want to share just a little bit about your story, it doesn't have to be necessarily jumping right into back pain, but if you just whatever's unique or relevant for your story for sharing about your back pain, please open up.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. I never thought that I would be in a position where I'd be able to share my story and be able to tell success, or that I'd even have an issue, because this was really the first injury I ever had. I grew up playing soccer. I was always an athlete. In my 30s, I got into dance and pole dance and yoga and just like moving my body nonstop. So it was a real punch in the gut when I just did not fall off the pole and hurt my back, but in the most boring, mundane way, moved a cooler that I thought was empty, but was actually like 200 pounds at the wedding reception. And that kicked off a very long journey of chronic back pain.
So you weren't breakdancing on the dance floor and sprained something.
No, it was so lame.
No, yeah. I've, this is our second episode. And last episode, I told Andrew, is usually picking the pillow up the floor, or for me, I was putting groceries in the fridge, and then you're 25, and you're like, I'm on the floor and I can't move. But that's kind of unfortunate at your wedding reception. How did the night turn out?
Well, it started off and it was just like, ooh, that was heavy. That tweaked a little bit. And then usually I would be up and about, like going on a regular routine. But since it was my wedding weekend, I had a lot of friends and family in town. So I was sitting and entertaining. And then I just remember like wiggling, like, ooh, something feels off. I'm just going to keep on wiggling. And then went up north for my honeymoon, and it was like a 4-hour car drive and just being in excruciating pain, and just figuring at that point, like, oh, it's just like a muscle issue. You go to Google, the first thing it says is like, don't do bed rests, stay moving. So I was going on hikes, but like my poor husband was putting on my hiking boots because I couldn't bend over. It hurt so much. And I felt like it was the worst bait and switch you could ever do to somebody immediately upon saying wedding vows.
Yeah. Really putting in that in sickness and health to the test right away. Yeah. So where did you honeymoon? You said up north.
Up north in northern Minnesota, just at a cabin.
Okay. Well, that's fun. I honeymooned in northern Michigan, and they call it up north there too. So I know there's a little bit of competition on who owns the northern woods. So, or maybe that's Wisconsin. Wisconsin and Michigan, now that I'm thinking about it, they basically have up north competition where it's like, they're like, no, this is my upper peninsula. It's like, no, this is my upper peninsula. So anyway, so how old were you then when you at your wedding?
I was just turned 36.
Okay. So prior to that, pretty active, never really experienced back pain before.
Correct. And I told the doctors, like, I'm the healthiest I've ever been. I'm the strongest I've ever been. It felt very unfair because definitely been other times that I should have been more breakable.
Yeah.
Mm.
What was your first initial like, I hate using the word journey, your initial kind of process in the medical system, like finding a diagnosis, or what did that look like?
I was stubborn. It took me 2 months to make a virtual appointment. So I spent 2 months just being like, well, maybe if I do this yoga or this stretch or Google it enough or rest it or walk on it. So it took me 2 months. And then I made a virtual appointment with um, like a general practitioner. And he said, maybe it's like an SI joint pain thing. And he gave me some YouTube videos. And when that was not it. I was still in a lot of pain, like sitting or sneezing or driving. That's when I went to urgent care over a weekend and got my first X-ray. Um, they noticed a crack in the back, which they said like maybe it's a stress fracture, but it could also be an old injury. And so they said,
Yep.
"Have you ever like hurt your back before?" And I said no. And then I had to wait, I think like 6 weeks to get an MRI to see if it would get
Whoa.
better in that time for prior authorization. And then it was the MRI that they really wanted to look at the stress fracture, and they looked at it and was like, "Oh, that's old," which
Yeah.
also told me that MRI is like, just because we can see things, it doesn't mean that it's really an issue. Because that was not the issue, and that's where I think they said it was probably a bulging disc, and I may have already started physical therapy at that point.
Mm. What did you wait around, like just staying active or whatever during those 6 weeks, or what was your kind of game plan before your like MRI? Because I think when I'm like looking on the Reddit, lots of people are like, oh, I'm just waiting around for the next 2 to 6 weeks for my next scan or something.
Um, After I went to urgent care, that's when they told me I needed to stop doing anything until I had the MRI. I'm trying to remember the timelines. But I think I was still walking. I might have gone to like a little bit of yoga, just like cheating. Um, but it wasn't until I started physical therapy that I really got the message around like everything that's causing pain, just stop doing it. And I was able to go to a physical therapist that specialized in performing arts. So I felt like they knew dancers and knew what I was trying to get to. But that was also just heartbreaking when they said like you can only do these 3 exercises and you can't do anything else.
Andrew, there's already a whole can of worms to open up here. This is I'm containing myself. So the first question that we'll get into the PT experience in a moment, but my first kind of question is: a lot of people think, "Oh, I have to wait for an MRI." What was your first gut like reaction to thinking I need to wait 6 weeks?
Oh, I was so mad. I was
Yeah.
so mad because if it was a stress fracture, then I'm going around with like a broken back, and it's really hard to avoid moving
Mm.
or bending your back just to live.
Mhm.
Um, I could talk a lot more about prior authorizations. Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
I think your case is a little bit tricky as well, because if I hear like there's a potential fracture, I'd be pretty cautious as well as a practitioner, because that's like up there on like things to look out for.
yeah. I mean, if the urgent care people, they're not really set up to have MRIs, right? And the X-ray imaging, as they said, only shows so much. It doesn't have like a timestamp on like a stress, an old fracture. I think even my dad had like a wedge fracture, and they were like, "This could have happened 20 years ago." Or, it was something like, yeah, so it's better to be cautious in that case. So, waiting definitely makes sense. I think you'll find people, there's two sides of the coin. There's an insurance authorization wait, and then there's well, maybe we're following the best practice guidelines, which is for many other cases, if there's no red flags, let's try conservative management. And then if
Yeah,
nothing's better, then get an MRI. But it sounds like they were concerned about the fracture. Yeah.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But I think as a practitioner, I'd like try and wean out um if you did have a big fall or anything traumatic. I think that'd be like a really big indicator. It's like, did you fall over or yeah?
Mhm.
But if it's just you were on your wedding day, super stressed, and it all just kind of happened and rolled downhill from there, it's like, okay, maybe I'm not as concerned, but I'm still a little bit cautious.
Other indicators like being, a younger female, maybe having, less muscle mass, being a little bit more thinner, also lower bone density, kind of all go hand in hand too. So I think looking at the whole picture, it's better to be safe than sorry, but curious, where was the old stress fracture or the old fracture?
I don't even remember. I think that
Okay.
like more in the spine, and I didn't have any like major injuries playing soccer or
Right.
anything.
Yeah.
Mm.
So we get the MRI, they look at the fracture, and they're like, not even worried about it.
Yeah, and they said the bulging disc and what L1S5 is that it?
Like L4, L5, S1.
L5S1.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always
Yeah.
mix.
That's okay. It's might matter, it might not. I don't know. What were your symptoms kind of up into that point, like on a regular basis, and maybe the initial symptoms? How did they progress? What was that like?
Yeah, the main symptom was that it was very, very painful to do anything where I had to bend over. They thought it was like curious at the urgent care. I always forget what you call the different ways of bending. I could bend backwards, no problem, no pain. But if I had to tie my shoe, if I had to sweep the floor, if I had to get into a car, if I had to sit for a long time, it was just like very, very intense. Um, Back pain. I felt like kind of wobbly in my lower back. And then as the months went by, it kind of spread down my glute into my leg, like sciatica, especially by the end of the day, it would get the worst after. I would try to stand up when I was working as much as possible and take little breaks. But as the days went on, it was just I would come home from work just crying out of just sheer pain.
And how long did that what's the like length of time you feel like that was going on for?
That was about 3 months until I started physical therapy in September. And then I still had pain doing physical therapy, but it got a lot better as the weeks went by. And I built the core strength and the hip strength. Um, and that's what I was, just able to get more and more relief and just have, like, I could drive without pain. I could sit longer without pain.
Good.
So I thought I was cured.
Yeah. And then what happened?
Um, my physical therapist, after 6 weeks, told me I could go back to pole, but instead of doing the whole hour-long class, she said, just like take it easy, do maybe 20%. I didn't take it easy.
Oh,
I
yeah.
didn't take it hard, but I did
For a long session.
I did an hour class.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I had been trying to do everything upright,
Mhm.
which is fine, but not that fun. But then even when I would just try to go back to anything that was inverting where I had that bending in my back, it started to just flare up and feel painful. So I just did try to slow it down a bit more. I kept on doing physical therapy, kept working on my back strength. I was able to perform in a show in October. I really want to do a showcase in October. I really focused on that and took it easy and just did that one performance. But then as I was trying to be like, okay, I want to get back to my dancing where it was before I was injured, it would just my back would start hurting again. And it was like back to square one. Especially whenever I really changed my routine. Like I went on a trip for Thanksgiving and I picked up my niece and then like my back just totally fell apart. Or around Christmas time, I was with more family and moving luggage or whatever and just like went back to square one. So wasn't until January that I was just like completely surrendered and it's like, I just need to figure out what's going on. And that's what I stumbled upon the Reddit post about the book.
So we're with when did you get married?
June.
So June to October-ish, kind of dealing with lots of things, trying PT, and then basically June to January. And okay. And then the symptoms were always kind of the same. You'd have a flare up. When you say pain, localized to the back or always running down the leg or random or?
Mostly localized to the back.
Okay. When it was running down your leg, you kind of sorted that out through PT, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, for just like hearing that story and the PT part, it's hard to hear PTs tell people to stop doing stuff. However, presentations in person are different. But I'm curious, did you feel like the things you were doing in PT were preparing you at all to get back to that class?
Yes, the PT, especially by the end of it, I started off like very, very basic, very, very basic exercises. But by the end, I was doing like Roman lateral chair lifts with weights and holding it, and like I could feel really, really a lot of strength being built. I was doing a lot of so like Roman chair tuck ups, which is very similar to like an invert move that I would do on the pole. So it felt very specialized, but just I would feel strong and like I was ready to go back and not having pain, and then it would just kick back up.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And being a PT who's also excited about the arts and things like that can be very, it is niche, but it can be very helpful for people who are, it's like, you understand my sport, you understand what I'm trying to get back to. It kind of sounds like maybe the duration and intensity just maybe too much too soon. So it's good to hear that the PT was taking good care in that regard. So, well, cool. So come to January. Andrew, is there anything else you want to ask about so far with her history?
No, that's good.
Okay. Very thorough. We're 15 minutes in and we're crushing it. So we stumbled across this book. Any idea what the post said, or is it just like, hey, go try this book?
It was, so I would go back and forth between being like very depressed and then times where I'm like, I'm going to be very, very positive. I'm going to find a solution. And I was in a mode of just like, I was very positive that I was going to figure something out. And it might have not even been on back pain Reddit, but it might have been like a chronic something was, and just one buried comment was like, it was in all lowercase letters. Try this, read this book, The Way Out by Alan Gordon. And something was just like, drew me to Google it. And then I just looked at the book, and it was about overcoming chronic pain, and downloaded it onto my Kindle. Didn't know anything about it, but read it in like one sitting. And he talked about his own story of having back pain, and that people, and I'd read this I know like everything there is about bulging discs, but I read it in my research too, that people have herniated discs or bulging discs all the time if you see an MRI, but they don't have pain associated with it. And that's what Alan Gordon had kind of said kicked off his exploration into getting to the root of pain. And that the part of the book that made a lot of sense to me was the idea that our brains could get wired into sending pain signals as a warning signal, even if there was no imminent danger. Like my back felt very strong. My core was very strong. I was fine. I should have been fine. And so I just spent that weekend like telling myself to relax and that it was okay and that I didn't need to be sending pain signals to myself anymore. And it was life-changing how fast. I had made another physical therapy appointment for that Monday, and it was Sunday night, and I was sitting there like, do I need to wake up at 6 a.m. and drive to this appointment? And if I cancel it, I probably can't get in to see this specialist in performing arts physical therapy for 4 weeks. But I was feeling better by the end of the weekend, and I canceled the appointment and was just like, I think this is it. I'm done. I'm good. I had signed up. I started going back to intro to pole classes. So like taking it easy. I remember my mom and my husband were like, are you sure? Can you really do this? And I said, no, like the pain is gone. I am better. I got to the root of it. Like I'm sure. And that was in January, and have not looked back since. Have only read the book one time.
I'm curious on what were some of your thoughts or story behind what was happening prior to the book. For example, it's like it's very structural based, and it's like these are the problems. It's like I possibly had a bulging disc and like in this area of the low back, and that was the entire cause of your pain? Or how did it make sense in your head?
Yeah, the only thing a doctor had said that had pointed to the cause of the pain was, oh, you have a little bulging disc. And then everything I read on the internet is like, it's a jelly donut. It'll go get better in 6 weeks. And just like driving me crazy because it wasn't getting
Way
better.
more than 6 weeks.
Mhm.
So I just figured like that was it. It must be a nerve issue. It must be a disc issue. We need to keep on like working on core and doing decompression. And I would like hang on this bar at my brother-in-law's house to like stretch out my back. And
How frustrated did you feel that it's like, if it's so structural, and or if it's entirely structural and you've done all the PT and you've gotten so much stronger, how did it make sense to you that you were still in pain? Or were you just like, it's still not healed? Or yeah, what's
yeah,
the thought
I
process?
thought it still was not healed. And I had there's somebody on YouTube who was on a similar boat as me, who was an athlete and did physical therapy and wasn't able to go back to sports the way that he was before, and has done a lot of work on mobility and tissue work and tons of lower back repair. So I thought I needed to just like only do way more strength, way more mobility, way more like weights on the lateral chairs. And so I thought there was just something mechanical that wasn't all coming together and wasn't healing, and needed like more, as I was like, because I'm an athlete, maybe I need more physical therapy. I need something on top of what I'm already doing. But it never occurred to me that it could be something that wasn't just physical.
Apart from like the physical therapy side, did you start to do things that you enjoyed in life? Like, did you go for hikes, or um, continue building up how long you were doing your dance for? Or was that
Um,
ever in the, I guess, rehab plan or program?
of my own rehab program.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I started doing more like just choreography on the floor, like just working on technique and things that was not like advanced tricks or anything, but just movement that felt good. I joined a studio where I just had like open space, but it was so depressing because I was used to being in class with all of my pool friends and dancing all the time. So then it was just like lonely to be like, well, I'm just gonna like
Can't do that
twirl,
anymore.
yeah, twirl
Yeah.
by myself. And I walked, but it was hard to not do yoga. It was hard to not like lift weights, or you kind of have to make the best of it. But it was hard. And I tried things like, I never thought I would do acupuncture. I hate needles. And that like I got some relief from that for like a couple days. But it was just
It's all
very
short.
tricky to get to the root of it.
So trying all these things leads us almost to this like fixer mindset, right? It's like, well, we got to fix it. There's an issue. I'm supposed to be doing all these things. And so it sounds like obviously that was very frustrating for you. In the book, it talks about fear. Do you feel like you were, at what point were you starting to think, before you got to the book, like, is this the new norm? Where were you feeling maybe some of that fear, if any?
Oh, for sure. I mean, especially doing internet research, I either heard that I should be recovered in 6 weeks, or else that this was going to be a chronic thing for the rest of my life and I would need surgery. Like there was almost nothing in between that I read. So it felt like there was no way out.
Yeah.
And that was like, I didn't accept that, thankfully. But it did feel like, and that's why I went on Reddit to share my story, was because I just did not read success stories of people
Yeah.
recovering after it had been more than 6 weeks.
Yeah. I think it's even sadder to hear and read that, like, once you read the word chronic, you're like, wait, that means forever, or like for the super long term. I think it's a really bad, I guess, way that clinicians or researchers have like worded it or titled what it is. But I think we're moving towards like even it's like chronic just means there's more variables at play than just structure, but people don't really see that little subtext or sub meaning and extra definition of that. But it's like that's how I see chronic or persisting pain. It's like, why is it still here? It's like, let's try and dig deeper. Let's look at other parts in your life as well.
Have
And
you
like,
guys heard stories like mine?
Oh yeah.
yeah,
So I worked in a chronic pain clinic where we only saw cases like this. So they had tried, this is like, I am so thankful for I have a mentor who pointed me in all these directions, and he was my mentor at this clinic. Shout out to David. And he helped me see in action for a lot of these things. And neither of us had actually read Alan's book, but he was familiar with Schubner. Dr. Schubner is familiar with John Sarno, actually. I mentioned, actually, I'm just realizing I mentioned earlier about his origin, just the mind-body prescription. Yeah, mind-body prescription. Side story, I guess, to this side story. My brother had plantar fasciitis, so he thought, for 3 years. Was a runner, could only wear Birkenstocks. Was like, nothing works. He went to 3 specialists. Only one said it might be plantar fasciitis. And he was living in New York City at the time, so I think he had like an abundant, pool of specialists to choose from. And he read this John Sarno book, and then he literally read it front to back, put it down. A day later, read it again, and after 3 years of persistent pain, could walk in any shoe, like just totally melted away. And my brother told me this story before I became a physical therapist, so I was like, that's on my radar. And then in PT school, I did a bunch of podcast listening because I was driving an hour and a half or so to school, almost 2 hours actually. So I was very lucky to get exposed to some of these ideas before I even graduated. Fast forward to a clinic rotation, I'm working with a clinic who all these people have had scans that are clean, and they can have even the wildest neurologic presentations. So something called functional neurologic disorder, where it maybe presents acutely like a stroke in maybe young, healthy people, but there's still a lot to be learned about it. But they present like left-sided neglect. Like, we had this young person who couldn't, you could say, hey, raise your right arm and push this object, and they just couldn't figure out how to do it. And this idea that all these scans are clean starts to go, okay, well, how can we use stories like these to apply to people even with structural based, maybe, as the book points out, that there's, neuroplastic pain, but also pain that is really derived from clearly a structural problem. And so I think it's all, as Andrew points out, bioplastic, it's all connected. So I just always, I have like a couple questions before this tangent's, over, but that, we saw a lot of people with your story where we would come in and work on what I found out later is probably called somatic tracking or pain reprocessing, therapy, but I just didn't know that's what it was called. But for people who are listening now who are automatically heard John Sarno and they think about all this mindfulness stuff, who abruptly just say, well, that's just nonsense. What would you say to them, like right now, in order to continue listening? Because the story's not over.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it doesn't hurt to try. That's, I think, like the best, like, unlike surgery or taking pain medicine or something, like there's really no downside to trying. And I think, like, I'm sure emotions have a role in what we experience in our body, but I think even if you don't have, even if you were like me, where you were like, I was in a very happy time in my life and I could still have pain that I eventually found out was not structural and was able to change with brain wiring, to just keep an open mind about it, because it won't hurt you if you try. Then you might just get really good relief.
I find people who say they've tried everything, it's like, well, hold on, there's more. And that's usually the people who have that fixer mindset where, well, I did a deep tissue massage, it was great, now it came back, I did the dry needling, those types of people. I try to very gently explore this idea of neuroplastic pain, because you can have an acute injury, and maybe you did on your wedding day, but there's always a natural history to all injuries. the human body heals very well in majority of conditions and circumstances. So that pain though can be learned. So we can have a structural changing, healing, right? It's like if an arm breaks and you have a fracture and you put it in a cast and it no longer hurts, it's still broken, but there's certain contextual, it's replaced, it's casted, maybe you got some pain medication. But I find it, very interesting. People are ready to just dismiss this approach. So when people say, "Oh, then pain's just all in my head," what would you say to that?
Well, this is a little bit of a tangent, but one of the things that we learn in pole dancing is where you can do a move for the first 2 or 5 times, and it is so painful because your body doesn't know what's happening. So it's like there's a cold metal bar, and I'm like holding my legs up between, and then it's like excruciating pain because your body, like your brain, is trying to save you because it's a new sensation. And then once you learn it's safe, you can do the exact same move with zero pain at all. So maybe this is kind of a similar, like,
Yeah.
the way that we experience pain can be both because there's a broken bone and it's a structural thing, or it's because it's about safety and our brain trying to protect us. But I forget what you asked.
You said tangent, and I was like, "Welcome to the club," because I've got those. And then I started, thinking about how difficult pole dancing is, and I'm like, it's extremely athletic. But the question was really like when people immediately go, because I've had this, right? When I first learned about pain neuroscience, Andrew, I don't know if you've experienced this. I was like all excited to be like, "Oh, it's just your nerves. They're triggering. It's this, and the explanation turns into like they go, "Oh, it's just in my head." And I'd be like, "Yes, pain is an output of the brain." And what I learned is that like all pain is real. It's a experience, and it's maybe what's triggering that pain that's important. And there's many contextual factors. Some that come to mind are, yes, changing the context of what's safe and what's not. If you think about those people that hang from hooks from the ceiling, I don't know if you guys watch like X Factor or whatever, and you're like, seeing these people who are like, wow, that looks painful. It doesn't hurt to them because either they've exposed themselves to it gradually or they change the context. And it's like, you have people who enjoy pain too. So very interesting, some of the examples you can find with contextual factors.
Yeah, it's like we learn so much, right? Like even apart from like the pain side, it's like I think even the healthcare side as well. It's like what do we expect from doctors or from caretakers, right? It's like maybe as a kid when you got hurt, maybe your parents did give you stuff, right? So it's like maybe it's not that they have the fixer mentality, but ever since like we were a child, we're so used to people giving something to us to like fix externally. And then now since like pain is such a mixed phenomena, it's like everything is included in this, like how we think and like how things are portrayed in front of us as well. It's like gets so confusing.
Yeah. The question, so like I actually think I have some plantar fasciitis, or at least the pain.
Mhm.
I had to Google like why do my feet hurt in the morning?
Mhm.
But how would you suss out if it's structural or bioplastic or
Or like
neuroplastic?
even in like the quote unquote tendon world, before, if you do Google it, Google will probably say it's an inflammation issue. But the more you get into the research, it's now saying it's a mix of both. Maybe in the short term, it might be inflammation, but in the long term, they're like, we have to look at other factors as well. It's like we have to expand. It's like how much, okay, if we look at the more physical side, it's like how much activity are we doing? And apart from that, it's like, how do we think about that thing as well? It's like, are we scared that if we continue using it, it will continue to get inflamed more? And now you're getting scared of using it at all. And now you're avoiding doing stuff. And now possibly if you're stopping to do things and avoiding everything, physically, you might get deconditioned as well. So it's like, it's such a giant can of worms in that aspect as well.
Yeah. So what I would say my biggest maybe scrutiny or just an observation I made reading Alan's book is that they separate, just like people have a hard time separating or rather combining that there's physical and there's the psychosocial, they separate those two things. It's flipped. We can't it's not so black and white. There's not a dichotomy in my mind. It involves all the human body and experience. So it could be, it's hard to say, and it's hard to say definitively, but what I would say in regards, in conjunction to what Andrew is saying, is essentially structures do take on a certain amount of force when obviously the joint moves, right? So this is where I struggle, because I've tried to combine both into one like intervention, and the biomechanics matter. So if you have a foot that's more rigid, the plantar fascia doesn't get to stretch and release some energy. So the bones don't also splay as much. So I have found, and Andrew, I don't know if you found this, but people that tend to have that heel or plantar fascia pain, they sometimes have a very high arch and a rigid foot that many dancers have. I don't know necessarily why, but I find that if you are constantly having a high arch and as you walk, the foot doesn't flat, that's like my very first approach when I try to introduce overcoming that plantar fasciitis. And then also the whole activity thing that Andrew's referring to, is how much activity is too much activity. And then where I find the learning about neuroplastic pain comes into play is, how can we make sure this person's having the reassurance that it is manageable, and that they can overcome it, that they're not limited by fear. That's where that part comes in. And it's not so much because I gave the example of my brother. I think the 3 years of him struggling with it, I don't know. It's weird how somebody can you're the second person I've heard of in this reading the book and having pain gone within 2 days.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting how fast it happened as well. So maybe I'm guessing, like, these are just complete guesses. Maybe you're more open-minded and like trying new experience, and because you're very open, it's like, and willing to explore, your body's just learning way faster instead of getting hooked onto these initial thoughts. That's my little guess.
Yeah. Plus how Alan kind of dives into how emotions are, at play when somebody's having pain. They're interconnected. There's different parts of the brain that trigger, and the human body, or probably any animal, but the brain, we're just all looking for efficiencies. And a lot of people talk about how smart the brain is, but really, if you think about it, it's got a lizard brain on top of, yes, a more aware and a lot more like cognitive processing taking place brain, but it's efficient. And if it thinks something isn't safe, it's just much quicker to protect.
Yeah.
There's a book I have somewhere above my head called How Emotions Are Made, and it talks about the predictive nature of that pain, that neuroplastic pain response, where it's like you're constantly making predictions about safety. And when your body and mind don't correct a false trigger, it becomes pain, and then it becomes learned. So yeah, it's like, okay, we can know all this cool stuff, and maybe it's still a lot of theory, but we're really close with those functional MRIs, and we're learning a lot. So it's like, okay, how do we create interventions for people, and how do we really help people? So for your instance, like yes, I would absolutely want to look at like biomechanically how your foot moves and how your knee and a hip, and then look at your history of activity, and then definitely reassure you without going into the pain neuroscience rabbit hole and making you be like, oh, it's just in my head. And then you start running marathons again or something. Like there's definitely, it's hard to separate.
Yeah. I think from my position and where you're at right now in your journey, Kenza, you can probably dive and like mix it all together as well. It's like, if our brain is bioplastic and our body is bioplastic, and we have like receptors and whatever on our like feet and everything as well, just sending the rest of our body information, maybe we can explore different specific, quote unquote, they might start off like biomechanical little foot exercises and stuff, but it might be more so exploring these movements to see how your foot feels in like these certain positions. And maybe you're like, oh, this isn't dangerous, and like you looking at your foot move in a specific way might be able to go, okay, I feel safer practicing these things in a controlled environment as well. So now that might be moving towards like a quote unquote exposure therapy kind of thing. It's like the more you expose yourself to a certain thing, your body kind of habituates or just gets used to feeling these sensations and knowing that, oh, okay, it's not that bad, or it isn't bad at all, and this is completely normal. And yeah, you can slowly, I guess, become desensitized or get used to a certain type of thing, and you may or may not feel better depending on how you practice these certain movements.
Fascinating.
Yeah, what's funny is before I was talking to Andrew for a few minutes before Kenza joined, and I said, I just really don't want us to get too clinical because the audience is people like Kenza, people who are experiencing, back pain. But, and I think an example that could be helpful for people who are listening is I did have a patient one time, quick tangent, who was experiencing ankle pain for like a year, right? So when you think about persistent pain that's lasting for a long time, that's when you start to go, okay, how are these neuroplastic, how are the bioplastic components like coming into play here? If it's I've had plantar fasciitis for 2 weeks, okay, maybe we are a little bit more structure based and we just need to modify activity and things like that. So I think that would be the first thing. And then actually at the end of Alan Gordon's book, did I say Alan Gordon? Or is it Argon? Oh yeah, Al Gordon. There's an appendix that will highlight certain questions that will help people decide what's maybe neuroplastic, what's structural. I think that's helpful. But for this particular person that had hurt their ankle, I was working on them as a student, and this was in a regular clinic. And she's like, I've had pain for a year, and I broke my ankle. And she at that time had also recently lost her dog. She had only one family member who lived out of state. She was an independent woman, kind of in her late 40s, early 50s, who was used to taking care of herself and could no longer even climb the stairs, couldn't, do all these sorts of things. And so her life really kind of just turned upside down. And I just gave her a strategy that works for people with persistent chronic pain called emotional journaling. And I said, if you're open to it, just go home, get out a sheet of paper or two, and write down just everything that you're feeling regarding your situation, your diagnosis, the things you can't do. And when you're done, just rip it up and throw it away. And a week later, so I saw her once, she came back and she was like, the pain's 50% better. The next time she came back, she's like 25% more. So we're 75% there. Next time she came back, it was like no pain, walking, not as far as she wanted, but had to reintroduce like intensity and distance. Like I can't walk as fast or as far right now, but had opened up a whole, window of opportunity for her to be active again. So for anybody listening who's like, wants a tangible strategy, just like really easy. You can like hit pause and just start this right now. I highly recommend not sharing it with somebody, but just throwing it away because it's almost like you're dealing with it. But this is another example of I've seen anecdotally work, and it has been shown in conjunction to other interventions to be helpful, like physical therapy. It's crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about like the human / more cognitive processes about like what happens in the body. But I guess like in clinic, it's like maybe depending on the person in front of me, if you're interested or not interested in all these little ways our body works, it's like it might be as simple as, hey, let's explore some different foot movements today, or different squatting or hinging or just knee and hip movements today, and see how that goes. And maybe just testing them out, you're like, oh, I do feel better and safe just doing these easier movements. It's like, okay, awesome. Next time, let's try something a little bit hard or something a little bit different to what we did last time. You just practicing all these things, we're just more able to see opportunities that we didn't see before. It's like, oh, before I would have been super scared and super conscious and fearful when I do walk on uneven ground, and that makes my foot hurt. But once we do practice, like, I don't know, balance or just walking around on top of little balls or something in the clinic, you're like, oh, I feel okay doing this. And then you're just more confident out in the real world as well.
I assume people get better all the time just from doing their PT.
Yeah, I was, I think we're very lucky how responsive the body can be during like a normal natural history. When a natural history is like, if you take a condition, the normative amount of time that it takes for something to just naturally heal, like that, the timeline it takes for that to happen. The majority of people will probably experience that for all the conditions. And so, yeah, there is a subsection of people who, for whatever reason, just aren't getting better no matter what you do. But that's where it's so tricky. It's like, okay, what's really going on here? But yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. You're like, wow, for me it took so long. You're like, is it people just get better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not just the physical active side of PT or whatever. There's like so many different options, or like what Andy mentioned, it's like that more cognitive and emotional side that people might connect more with. There's like 1,000 or 100,000 different ways of just like skinning the cat, and everybody responds so differently. And if you might need like a certain type of connection with the clinician as well. It's like if you both resonate and you both like see eye to eye on a lot of things, and maybe you will get better faster compared to two people butting heads the whole time. You're like, you're not listening to me, and then everyone's saying you're not listening to me either, and it just doesn't work out, right?
Is there any message that you would want to say to patients who walked in that you can't say off the back, but that you're thinking in your minds?
You mean like they come in and they're telling me their story and I just have to bite my tongue?
Mm-hmm.
What's funny is I'm pretty transparent with people. So if I can build a rapport quickly, I might try to joke around with people. I just try to make people feel as comfortable as possible. And you can kind of read what you can get away with, but I wouldn't really say, I think just, rambling just now took me that long to think of one. Basically, I don't hate chiropractors, but when somebody comes in and they talk about manipulations, and the first instinct I want to do is like overeducate on high velocity manipulations. And the reason I don't attack chiropractors is there are manual therapists that are PTs or other osteopaths or people who also use these tools or interventions. And then it's the narratives that follow that I get sort of cranky about. It's hey, you have anterior pelvic tilt, we're going to fix that by pulling on your leg, or you have an upslip, or some of these anatomical normal variations that somebody's trying to fix with a manual therapy technique, who we've talked about narratives being fearful, who you might, without even knowing it, be creating more harm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the issue I have. So that's what I want to dive in and be like, you can stop going to the chiropractor unless like it's working. But
Yeah, I think it's a story around how they're quote unquote selling what they're trying to do. So I don't think it's very evidence-based to say it's like we are trying to realign these 5 bones in your foot, therefore your plantar fasciitis or whatever will go away. But you have to get that done every week. It might end up like saying, oh yeah, this in the short term, massages and just people I guess touching an area and just make it feel looser can make you feel good, right? And feeling good can make people, or allow people to use their foot in different ways. So it's like if you're now able to walk after like a massage or an adjustment, that's like a super good thing, right? In the short term. But in the longer term, it's like, okay, how do we continue just you doing stuff to self-manage, or continue on your own journey by yourself? So it's like independence.
it's very smooth of you to switch roles there, Kenza. It's like a mass communications career there at work. I wanted to point out real quick. So, did you go through any of the actual practices of the book, or just simply reading it and understanding the role of fear was enough for you to be like, oh, I can just get going?
I just got going. I think some of the somatic tracking, I just feel like I didn't need it as much, and just when I went to sit down, thought like, you're totally fine. You're okay. You can sit at
Mhm.
the dinner table. You're good. You're fine.
Mhm.
Totally normal, and nothing's wrong. And just
Welcoming.
and Yeah, and I did that when I went back to dance too, like that first class. If I felt a little pain and got like scared or tight, they said like you're totally fine, you're totally healed, you can relax, you're fine, and it went away.
Do you feel like knowing that and kind of maybe executing, I guess, that strategy, you felt an awareness that you had in your body, like a more relaxed state, or like beforehand you might have had tension, but after reading the book, telling yourself it's okay, maybe you're a little bit more relaxed through your.
Yeah, I was so much more relaxed. It was when you have a back injury, you just are so used to being stiff and bracing and constantly being on the edge about how you're moving or sitting. So I was able to just physically relax a lot more. And even to this day, like I felt a little tweak in my hip at class yesterday, and just instead of being like, oh my gosh, did I ruin something? It's like, just relax, like you're probably fine. And then just relaxing. I forgot about it until now.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I brought it up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why I like the word welcoming experiences instead of us fighting or pushing away like how we feel. It's just like, okay, let's explore it. And then maybe exploring and sitting in the mud, you do start feeling better, or it just doesn't get worse. And then you're like, oh, if it's not getting worse and it's like tolerable, it's like, okay, yeah, I think I'll be better after this. It's just a little bit sensitive right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And then maybe you sit down or just take a breather or take a step back from the situation. It's like, oh, I do feel better just relaxing or not worrying overly about this one thing, about this tiny little sensation that we're feeling in that moment.
Exactly.
Well, Kenza, it's been an hour of your time. We do appreciate you spending that hour with us and sharing your story. If I know you've gone over this a little bit already, you've already given some really good information and nuggets for people who might be experiencing something similar. But if you had to succinctly, if somebody was listening to this that you knew was experiencing the exact same thing, what would you tell them? Maybe how would you summarize your experience to help them?
I would say that it is a horrible experience, but it is totally possible to make a full recovery, with an emphasis on the full recovery, that it doesn't need to be like you can go back to your life except for a few things. Like you can really make a full recovery.
Cool. Awesome. Well, we will go ahead and just sign off then. I do, again, appreciate you stopping by. This isn't what is this? This is
We stopped by.
Yeah. All right. Well,
thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for ending it.
Thank you for sharing your experience.
Yeah. Super happy Kenza was our second guest because she has a very interesting story that more recently in the last year I've been diving into a lot of the cognitive processing, a lot of the things that Alan Gordon touches on his book, which, by the way, if you're interested in this book, I'm going to put a link to the Amazon. We get no royalties, nothing to support him, and that'll be in the show notes. But for somebody to come on and be like, here's my experience, I learned that my pain shouldn't be surrounded by fear, and what that did to her body and how she responded is so fascinating. So I think for people who are skeptical, like Andrew, what would you say maybe your clinical reasoning is for maybe why it works so quickly? Deep question.
Yeah. Why does it work so quickly?
She said 2 days and her pain was gone.
I'm unsure, because if you actually looked at that Boulder study, even though there was like a bunch of people who did get better, there are people who are like in the midway and with, or like somewhat better and like small improvements. So obviously there's still like a distribution there, but on average, most people got a lot better. That's why I like kind of alluded to just guessing or pointing out some notable aspects of like how the way she thought and how open-minded she was. So I'm not sure if that's just like part of her personality, or if that's something that can be learned or taught or even experienced by like just exposure therapy or whatnot, and just like exploration in the clinic and just trying and just talking about some processes that people can test.
Yeah, it's difficult.
So the why is really hard to answer. Like, I'm just throwing out guesses. It's like maybe bit of a personality. Maybe that she was like, I am strong, and she had that like resilience um thread, or that little thought loop already, and then she was like, I am resilient. I have proof by doing all the PT for the past X amount of weeks or months, right? And it's like, I've been active my whole life. It's like, surely I can't be that weak or that structurally broken.
Yeah.
And it's like those her little skeptic inside of her really pushed her towards recovering.
Yeah, I think all those are good options for kind of making sense of it. One thing I didn't get to touch up on because I felt like, I mean, I looked at the clock and it easily, already been an hour. So, biomechanically, this is how I make sense of it. We try to give people more options when they have potentially less, right? So maybe it's a mobility issue, maybe it's a capacity issue. And I think cognitively, there are also, it's good to have more options. So if somebody
Yeah.
is stuck in this fear-based cycle, how does our body hold itself when it's stressed out? And you think about people whose shoulders rise up when they get a little stressed out, a little anxiety.
Guarding, protecting.
Yeah. So there is some, I'm sure, elements of that. I also think you come back to like the neurons that fire together or wire together.
Wide
So
together.
there's some overcoming, I'm sure, neurologically that's happening when you build up a resilience. You give yourself more options to move forward instead of feeling stuck. So acceptance commitment therapy and talking about psychological flexibility, these are all things. It's like, how do we fit this into a nice little neat little like thing that makes sense? And that's difficult. And for people who maybe in that Boulder study who get better but aren't quite fully there, I would say to them that maybe there's a difference between pain and suffering. So there are people who psychologically suffer and have no physical pain. There are people that have physical pain and who are just super happy-go-lucky. And, you know, I use these sort of ideas to try to make sense of it all. So I would say probably a combination of everything, which is the easy way out. But having dropped the guard and the fear of what's going on in her body, having imaging to confirm, like, oh yeah, there's really, in her case, very mild stuff, which makes it harder for other people who have lots of stuff. But even those people who have lots of stuff can have relief. So kind of tying in all those concepts is kind of how I make sense of it, giving her the freedom to continue to move forward and be more active, having a flare up, but then learning from it. Like all those are normal kind of processes for overcoming kind of what she was dealing with.
Did she ever mention how many months out she was from being pain free?
Well, January
Or
she
do we
read.
just, she said it was in
January she read the book. So, whoa.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a decent like time frame as well to like
Yeah.
have a follow-up conversation.
Right.
So I think that's like a really good outcome.
Right. It's not like she it was 2 days ago and she's like, yeah, it's gone. Now you can be like, okay, there is something maybe to kind of her experience, but let's see. It says,
Yeah.
her original comment says, in January 2024, 7 months after my injury, I came across a Reddit comment in the book. I read it in a day and I worked on it. And within 24, 48 hours, my pain had completely subsided. It's been 8 months.
Yeah. I do see a lot of new perspectives that she's taken on. Like near the end, she mentioned how she made connections with how things might hurt or tweak in that short term, but then she's able to still in that moment take a step back and like not be super fearful and get re-sucked back into that little negative fear avoidance loop again.
Mm-hmm. She didn't even really do some of the techniques that the book touches on, which is something called like somatic tracking, which is, where you maybe get in a comfortable or as comfortable as you can get position, and you basically do a mindfulness scan of your whole body. So you're kind of closing your eyes, you're following from head to toe different areas of your body, and you're just seeing essentially how you respond. And I've done this in real time with people, and it's gotten some wild, responses where people are like, the pain's moving with me. It's starting in my back, but it's moved to my neck. It's not in my back anymore. And when you have these like weird responses, that's when you start to kind of think, if the pain is random, if it comes on in a period of time in your life where there's more stress, these are starting to be some clues that it might be more neuropathic, especially if it's persistent. So always get things checked out by a medical provider, get imaging if you need to, but we are the proponent that if there are no red flags, try conservative management and pick up this book. And just really honestly, what we can say at this point is just have an open mind.
Yeah, I know even Alan Gordon mentioned in the book, he had a patient story. I'm not sure if you remember it or not, but he said one of his patients at the beginning, she was like, the 10 minutes of somatic tracking was super helpful. But then when she flared up again and she was like, I need to do this and it will fix me, became unhelpful. And then
Right.
he was just like, do you see how you're trying to chase an outcome instead of just welcoming the process? And then I think the takeaway from that little extract was that the patient slowly cut down how much somatic tracking she was doing. And then she ended up only doing like 5 to 10 seconds of it for it to be effective compared to doing the whole in detail thing, which might be really important to learn and explore at the beginning stages. But if you're more experienced and you just have reoccurrences in the future, it's just like, okay, maybe now the thing that we're trying to do is no longer useful, doing the super in-depth version. And it's just actually connecting with the rest of life again after taking a 5-second breathers might be what she needs.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really difficult for people to kind of embrace. I find that people on Reddit are going to have a really hard time embracing this idea. They're going to resort to John Sarno, or they might be in a situation. Sorry, when I say resort to John Sarno, I mean they'll turn and be like, it's going to be like this guy. And I'm not into it because the guy had some pretty radical ideas. I think he just was too early. But all in all, people might have to hit sort of rock bottom before they consider, something like this, which, I think everyone's going to be a little bit different. And I've been accused of it being like toxic positivity, which I think is not very fair because it's very kind of like in-depth reasoning, and they've got pretty good, stories on research, the Boulder study, and then anecdote, of course. So that's what I would say to somebody: just have an open mind.
Yeah, it's just like, I think, like I mentioned before, it's going back to the what we learned as a kid and what are our current expectations, and do our expectations put a glass ceiling, or does it put up a little barrier in what we can move towards? And it's hard to tell if it does or doesn't, and that's like extremely individual, because sometimes these things don't and sometimes they do.
Yeah. There's not even I mean, this isn't quite exactly what you're touching on, but it's similar. But we didn't even get into like adverse childhood experiences, which, a young developing nervous system that experiences trauma, whether it's verbal or physical or anything like that, or sexual, it's like those can, they haven't proven this, but there's a correlation to people who develop chronic pain who have adverse childhood experiences. So definitely an interesting world. We are coming up, I'm sure we're over an hour on the total episode, so we'll probably just close it here. And if you are somebody that is dealing with pain, hopefully this is something that resonated with you. Hang in there, have hope. If you are somebody that's overcame your back pain experience and you'd like to share your story, please just reach out to us, either on Instagram or Reddit, or you can email us. You'll find my email in the show notes. But beyond that, hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and we'll just see you next time.
All right, bye.
Yep. Bye, Andrew.